All right. Welcome, welcome. My name is Philip Davidovich, and I'm joined by my co-author and research manager on the Impact Fellowship Network, Tanisha Washington, for this presentation on the findings from the 2026 Impact Study. We've got a big amount of information to share with you today, and ultimately, we really hope that the value of this presentation is to navigate the report that we published just last week, actually to the broader community. This report has been a work in progress a lot for many of folks actually on the call that are part of the research consortium. Definitely a passion project that we spent well over a year, almost 18 months, with a community of over 20 partners to make happen. In a lot of ways, it builds off years and years of collaboration with this community that we actually just celebrated the 10 years anniversary with at the Impact Fellowship Summit, which is what you see on the picture of your screen that we had at the end of April. So yeah, shout out to Kristen Heck, who just put that in the chat as well. I think it's just an opportunity for us to share some of these insights and obviously make some room for future discussions. So a lot to share with us, and feel free to put any questions in the chat. We'll be consolidating those for the Q&A at the end of this discussion. So next slide. All right, so what we'll talk about today, overview of what the Impact Fellowships Network is, this project that facilitated this impact study. Then we'll talk a little bit about the research background and scope of this study, largely the research that preceded it, which was called the Fellowship Alumni Network Study, published in 2023, but then also the broader Impact Fellowship Summit community as well that has really championed and designed and driven this initiative along. Then we'll talk about the methodology. How did we make collaborative research work? What were the parameters? What were the considerations that we kept in mind throughout that process? And then, of course, the biggest part of the session, we will talk about the key findings and considerations to keep in mind throughout reading this report. Again, we hope this serves as a useful template as you go through the study itself. It's 72 pages, it's long, it can be dense at times, certainly, but we hope that it's informative and practical for the folks joining this call to incorporate in your program. That's really the motivation that we have with this study. Perfect. Thank you so much, Ariel, for sharing the link to the study in the chat for what folks that want to reference. Next slide. So what is the Impact Fellowship Network, or IFN? This is a program designed to elevate the global fellowship sector's ability to develop leaders who drive meaningful change. And at the heart of this program's mission is really a commitment to strengthen the fellowship ecosystem itself through research, community, and a supportive network. So how do we facilitate research? We will share a lot of that in today's presentation, but through co-design processes and trainings, IFN supports partners in evaluating program impact in ways that are responsive, relevant, and replicable, building shared knowledge across our network. As you'll learn throughout this discussion, especially when we get to the methodology, collaboration is at the heart of how IFN approach everything, but notably research in that design. So building tools and approaches and activities that are responsive, relevant, and replicable is really a driving force in making sure that this research isn't just a one-off. It is something that partners can grow with and take with them to their own organizations and can share with others in the sector. How do we facilitate community? We have a range of virtual, hybrid, and in-person events. I noted the annual Impact Fellowship Summit that we just wrapped up in April. We also have a series called the IFN Engage series, which is a continuous learning community that we have pop-up events in a lot of ways, at least every quarter throughout the year. And we facilitate those spaces to ensure there's inclusive of learning, sharing, and connection around issues that drive social change. So really what partners are really working on, how they want to kind of share their experiences with others, and most importantly, how they can connect with each other for further opportunities. And then finally, how do we facilitate a supportive network? Ultimately, this is cross-cutting around every activity that IFN facilitates, but it's about showing up. We make sure that we are accessible, both as a team and as a community, to attend events, maybe promote partner opportunities. In a lot of ways, obviously, IFN provides a lot of support, but we also are a platform to expand and promote opportunities within that community. The grounding motivations and values in each of those components are building a sense of belonging, trust, and mutual understanding that strengthen collaboration and meet evolving interests and needs. So, of course, like we have opportunities to continuously learn and listen about what the changing interests are within this community. But as heart, it's really about us showing up to each partner that is a part of this and making sure that your work is elevated and be able to promote those opportunities around the fellowship ecosystem as a whole. So those are really, in a lot of ways, that supported network are the grounding values that we keep in mind as a team through everything we do and trying to show up for partners as best we can in that process. Next slide. All right, meet the team. I'll keep this brief, but I'd be remiss before I shout out to the four all-stars that are really driving this program. My name is Philip Davidovich. I have the privilege of being the project director on this team and joined with Tanisha Washington, our research manager. Ariel Goose is also on this call as well. She'll be monitoring the chat, and she is rooting for Haiti, which I believe she put in the chat there in the World Cup. She's our community and events manager. Shout out for the facilitation at our most recent IFS Impact Fellowship Summit convening, but she also manages the IFN Engage series. So obviously the continuous learning community and those opportunities Ariel manages thoughtfully. And then Rebecca Zilberman is our partnerships lead. Those that have been a part of the Impact Fellowship Summit community know Rebecca deeply from actually bringing the Impact Fellowship Summit to IREX way back in 2018 and nurturing that community over the years as well. So as opportunities come up, as interests come up, this will be the four of us who will be connecting with you, working with you, and making sure that we can really honor those values I just mentioned around building a sense of belonging, trust, and mutual understanding and fostering that supportive network. So on to the next slide. Okay, before I hand it over to Tanisha to talk a little bit more about the back of the scope and methodology, I need to kind of emphasize the background of this research and the Fellowship Alumni Network Study that preceded this research. In a lot of ways, this was the foundation, both in process and findings, that paved the way for what we'll be sharing with you later in this presentation. The FANS was a collaborative research initiative published in 2023 that explored the impact of fellowship alumni and the role that networks themselves play in that process. So really grounded in what those relationships, what those connections, and what those communities themselves had as an impact within the fellowship experiences themselves. This really was a global initiative, reaching a total of 1,025 fellowship alumni across 102 countries. This included again, also similar, different group of partners necessarily, but also over 20 partners contributed to this study, in 24, including 14 distinct survey campaigns, 79 interviews, 13 focus group discussions. And so it really sets a metric of the vast amount of both qualitative and quantitative information we were able to collect through this initiative. Really encourage you to read the report. It is, as you'll note here on the top right corner on page 18, some of the main things to keep in mind as you're reviewing the document. But the three core findings that you really want to keep in mind that we found from fans that have shaped a lot of the direction that we've gone through with this research is right here on the right-hand side. Sustained relationships are a key factor in fellowship influences that contribute to changes at different levels of society. Tanisha will talk a little bit more about what those levels are, but talking about how relationships themselves over time were really valuable in contributing to changes at different levels of society for alumni. Aligned with that, personal friendships are essential in staying engaged, both as a sustained relationship, but with the fellowship network, especially over time as lives and careers changed. This study found that personal friendships were the linkage to a network that stayed relevant to a community as leaders grew in their careers and obviously in their personal lives. And then finally, it identified 3 areas of engagement that alumni are seeking out of their network: building relationships, sharing experiences, and accessing professional opportunities. That is really what's driving alumni to stay engaged and connected to their respective fellowship communities. So with that in mind, I will pass it over to Tanisha to talk a little bit more about the methodology and the scope for this impact study.
Thanks, Phil. So we were really able to expand the scope and the reach for this impact study. So we had 23 fellowship organizations and programs for this consortium who employed 20 survey campaigns, 88 interviews, 28 focus group discussions, and 8-part workshop series, which was led by an impact grant partner. And this really shows just what we were able to do in terms of convening and working together to develop these data collection tools. As far as reach, we were able to engage over 1,600 alumni and community partners from 141 countries. And so that's about 73% of countries, right? And so we really did expand our reach and scale for this study. Regarding the topics, we were able to go deeper into two topics that were explored in FANS. The first topic is around contributions to change, and we were able to go deeper by looking at the sub-level of changes that happen within each of the four levels of change, which I'll go into later. And then also highlighting the fellowship experiences that leadership value most. We were able to get more data and understand that more clearly. Two new areas that we were able to discuss and really find insights in the study were around barriers to change. And this came out from our design phase of this research, where one of our partners really was interested in understanding, are our programs acting as an intervention tool to support leaders in the work that they do? So before joining the program, are there challenges or barriers that they face in their work? And are the fellowship programs supporting the alumni or the fellows in mitigating those barriers? The fourth change that we explored, or fourth topic area, is how fellowships capture impact. And so this is a challenge that most programs face because it's underfunded, right? Or the person that's engaging in rural activities might also be doing another part of the program as well. So I will take us to the consortium structure. And so, like I mentioned, we were lucky enough to have 23 amazing partners who work on their own fellowship programs. And so all three engagement tracks, the network, the co-design, and impact grant partners, were able to contribute to research design processes, liaise with fellowship alumni and program teams, and disseminate data collection tools. So this is the base level of engagement that partners engaged in. And this is what our network partners committed to. In addition to that, co-design partners really worked closely with Phil and I to help create the data collection tools and templates. Um, and then we have our impact grant partners who, who received a $15,000 grant to support a distinct research initiative that's still aligned with the research questions. And this graph below is a logo or a combination of logos of all of our partners who are part of this amazing consortium. So let's dive into what the engagement really looked like for this consortium. So as Phil mentioned, community is a big part of this, of IFN, but also of the consortium. And so IFS is where we really began to recruit others to get folks interested in applying to one of these three engagement tracks. So once we had our partners chosen and their engagement tracks selected, we were able to go into the research design phase. And so this comprised of 5 convenings and was mainly about operationalizing our research questions. And this really focused on engaging our co-design partners and creating data collection templates, as well as our network partners who provided feedback on those co-created tools. So in total, we were able to create 7 templates, including surveys, focus groups, and interviews. And this is for alumni, but also for community members. And we were also able to create a reflection questionnaire for program teams. And so this next phase, the data collection phase, this was a 7-month period, and we really allowed it this time for folks to implement the data collection tools in a way that followed the rhythm of their own programs. And so this was less so about convening together as a group like we did for the research design phase. And really, Phil and I met one-on-one with partners to talk about how they want to adapt tools or the data collection templates with their current evaluation strategy. And we also did workshops and trainings. So partners were also interested and strengthening their research skills. So we were able to do a workshop on focus group discussions and how to implement those, but also social network analyses and creative methods. And during this time, the IFN team, we also did cross-programmatic cross-programmatic focus groups, which alumni joined. So we engaged them during that period as well, just to bolster the data, as well as, them engaging in the data collection activities of their own programs. So these were alumni of partners who are in the consortium. The fourth phase involved analyzing all of the data that was collected by our 23 partners and from those cross-programmatic focus groups. So the first session involved a sense-making session, and that was mainly about um, showing the preliminary findings of that data. And then after that, we were able to create our draft report and share it back with our consortium partners. Once we did that, we had a second convening that was meant to talk about that feedback and the structure of the report and things like that. So this was really an involved process, more than 18 months of really engaging thoughtfully and meaningfully with our consortium partners. So by mid-April of this year, we had our first edition, which was a special edition of the report, which was for IFS attendees only. Next, I want to talk about the key limitations, which is a part of all research, right? And the first limitation we experienced in this study is that data is self-reported and thus may have response bias or share only positive or affirming experiences. Secondly, data was collected via non-probability sampling, meaning we are unable to test hypotheses or infer causation with our findings. But rather, what the study does do is it draws out insights because this study is exploratory in nature. So we're still able to find themes and insights that we can test later. Lastly, we were unable to consistently collect demographic data and thus are unable to disaggregate the findings by nationality, for example. And I will pass it over to Phil to talk about code occurrence rate, which is one way we use to analyze our data.
Yeah, thank you, Tanisha. So as you go through the report, and again, kind of feel free to follow along with the page numbers on the top right corner of each slide if there's specific topics or points that are standing out to you. Code co-occurrence is a common approach in evaluating qualitative data, especially when you're dealing with transcripts from focus groups and interview discussions, as a way to find overlapping and potentially underlying connections between themes and trends that are coming up. With the volume of qualitative data we had in this study, Tanisha mentioned over 88 interviews, right? Several focus groups. I think it really stands out as a leap forward from what we are able to even collect during FANs. But dealing with so much qualitative data, code co-occurrence was a really valuable approach in figuring out how to put this puzzle together and figuring out what are the main trends that are standing out and how they might connect to each other. So what's code co-occurrence rate is, and referencing just that kind of term that you'll see throughout the report, is the presence of two or more qualitative categories in the same segment of data, and CCR, or code co-occurrence rate, notes that frequency as a percentage. So using the sample table of CCRs on the right-hand side here, which is real data, but we just kind of pulled one example table that you'll see throughout the report, using the segment of data of references to institution level change that fellows credit, whether partially or fully from their fellowship experience. Peer learning, for example, showed up in 70% of those references, taking again institutional changes, that total segment, and then this other code that we identified, this other theme of peer learning, standing out in 70% of those occurrences. As in practice, as you might see, this is pretty straightforward with regards to how folks just tell stories, right? I had this change, and the reasons that really stuck out to me was this experience, and it lines up with how we kind of identify peer learning. An important consideration too is every single code that we highlight in the report as well doesn't necessarily include every one we had in the study. We had a lot in the back end analysis side of piecing together different themes and finding the ones that really stood out. are defined in the annex of the report at the very end. So if there's a specific term or code that you're interested in digging into, feel free to reference the annex in the back, and that'll have a more comprehensive justification of what we define that code as. It's very important to note, and also in line with the limitations that Tanisha shared earlier, CCRs do not test correlation or causation of associated codes. They illustrate trends and connections between themes from a non-experimental research method, right? So this is a very valuable one. There are other approaches to evaluating qualitative data. Code co-occurrence rate does not connect that with causation or correlation. It's really just trying to figure out what alumni and community members are sharing in their experiences and seeing how themes might overlap. As is natural with every experience, it's not usually just one thing that is standing out with folks. So that is code co-occurrence rate. Feel free to reference page 35 for more details on that definition and how we approach the study. Next slide. The other thing I'd like to highlight is how we leverage AI. We have a section of this on the study as well. The two tools that we incorporated in this research were the enterprise version of Microsoft Copilot, which is a secure subscription model that we have at IREX that is able to kind of maintain analysis with sensitive information, and then Colab, which is a community platform that we work with TechChange to facilitate and manage a lot of the convenings. It's important to note, I think, one thing that we approached, obviously, AI is everywhere. Folks are talking about it a lot. But IREX and certainly the IFN team here took a rather risk-averse and patient process in figuring out how AI might be able to improve the quality and processes that we are already naturally developing. So the model or the graphic up the very top is intended to highlight how it really was only considered at the tail end of understanding clear workflows that we felt were compelling. So as is natural, we would start every kind of approach when we're talking either with data analysis or even with research management, collaborative as a team, before testing it manually and refining those processes over time. Once those were tested and we felt confident that the workflow components were finalized, for example, if you're going to a point of understanding your code book, which can take months of time and iterations to do manually to really understand what fellows might be saying, only then would we consider the question of, is manual processing or AI integration a valuable component of this? The graphic there is integrating AI at this stage of the workflow, made sure that we were bringing clear technical processes that were established so we could validate AI outputs and ensure they align with the manual processing expectations that we had practiced for often weeks or months before we considered this process. Another valuable component of tethering it to manual processing is it gave us a sense of confidence that we were able to do a review of what the outputs would look like before finalizing anything and bringing it to the final stage, which is the team synthesis and ultimately the outputs themselves of incorporating it into our work. Some of the examples of the workflows that we incorporate in this: consortium convenings and training workshops. So Tanisha mentioned in our methodology that we had several convenings with consortium members in different ways. We basically spent several hours figuring out what those convenings needed to look like, and they have even implemented several of those convenings. But once we had a clear framework of how we wanted to facilitate those, we used Colab. Colab has an AI model called Cola that they designed in-house to build a lot of the tables and the activities that would be ultimately used in those convenings themselves. So that was one example of how we leveraged AI in the consortium convenings. Another one, like grant management. There are consistent standards that we have both at IREX and then obviously within the expectations we set with partners on how the deliverables and also the agreements that we had to develop for their respective impact grants. So we did leverage AI to make sure we could review those more consistently and make sure that what we were developing with partners aligned with what the research was also kind of focusing on. So we did leverage a little bit of AI for that within our Microsoft Copilot suites. And then the ones on the right-hand side, the data management, the data cleaning and management, I kind of already had articulated. Once we got to a point where our code book was really solid and refined, which took months of manually reviewing all the transcripts by ourselves, we were able to lean a little bit more into AI to help us clean the actual transcripts themselves and have consistency so our analysis process could move a little bit more quicker. I could talk about this slide for a long time, and I do see it as being really transformative at how both Tanisha, myself, and the analysis team were able to come together around the data in a rapid way, multiple times a week, testing out new hypotheses, figuring out how well our codes align with what is going on. But I really want to emphasize too, it took a lot of time to get to that point in the development process, and really incorporating that made sure that we could trust and really manually review the outputs that AI would be producing at that point. And the last piece is content development. So we did find it useful when we do things like copy editing final pieces of the report, finding grammatical errors, making sure the formatting was consistent, and then obviously doing initial drafts of summary documents that we would have for internal teams that had specific requests, and then obviously for discussions with our consortium partners on how we'd have those facilitations. So it did help a little bit with those initial draftings of those content development. Again, we could talk about this for a while. I think we want to be as transparent as possible in the report itself, so we have a little bit more about that, and as well too how we're considering the environmental factors that go into AI and how we're doing our best to learn how we can leverage it in thoughtful and ethical ways. So that's that point, and I will move on to the next slide for findings. Cool. So Tanisha will kick us off with the next piece on the findings, which will talk about how fellowships support leaders in contributing to change. But I just wanted to remind folks of these 4 points because this is how the findings section is structured in the report themselves. So we'll flow through these points together. If you have a question, feel free to put it into the chat, and we'll answer all questions at the very end in the Q&A. But after the contribution to change piece, we'll talk about the barriers to change that we identified from the study, fellowship experiences that leaders value, and how fellowships capture change. A exciting kind of addition to, we'll also spotlight a couple partners, MPAC grant partners that we were able to bring into the study that really did some innovative and distinct approaches into evaluating some of these findings themselves. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Tanisha to take us on around contributions to change piece.
Thanks, Phil. And so contributions to change, this is where we were able to collect most of our data. And so you can see with the stat here, 91% of all alumni who engaged in this study were able to share a contribution to change that they credit fully or partly to their fellowship experience or to their community. And this is really powerful because, you know, engaging in interviews and focus groups and surveys, alumni were able to reflect and really um, just hone in on what experiences they've been able to create changes in and how fellowship experiences supported these changes at these 4 different levels. And I want to define these levels of change for you. So when we say individual change, we mean a change that happens in a personal or professional life for an alumni. At the institutional level, we define that as a change in organizations, government, or other entities that have structured norms and processes. For a community level, we define this as changes in large groups of people in larger society. And for the system level, we define that as changes in underlying influences that shape how societies operate, such as policymaking, for example. And so looking at this graph, one thing that I really want you all to take away is that these changes are interconnected. And Phil mentioned it earlier, right? But if you think of an alumni telling a story of how they have increased confidence because of their fellowship experience and how they have increased mobilization efforts, we would code that excerpt as an individual change for that increased confidence, but also at the community level for that increased mobilization efforts that they engage in. And so this is really important because it follows the logic model or the theory of change that we operate in most of our programs, right? How investing in an individual will have ripple effects of change at other levels of society. And I guess just to reiterate that point, that's why we see most of our changes happening and being identified at that individual level, and then tapering off as we look at the institution, community, and systems level. Diving deeper, we were able to expand on fans. And so we can see by the color-coded bar chart that within each level, we have these sub-levels or subcodes that we were able to see and identify as we were going through and analyzing the data. And so what's worth mentioning is, and how we built on fans, is that all of these subcodes or sublevels came out of our analysis of fans and was used as our starting point for analyzing the data. And all except for four of these subcodes um, emerged. And these subcodes include increased technical capacity, improved sense of belonging, which are at the individual level, spreading innovative solutions, and also improved organizational processes. And so these codes emerged as we were going through the data. The second point that I want you guys to take away from this slide is that looking at increased leadership capacity, right? That 58% of all the excerpts that we saw this code of increased leadership capacity. And what you may think is that there's one singular fellowship experience that's driving this change, like leadership development, for example. But that's not the case. Rather, it's a combination of fellowship experiences that's driving this increased leadership capacity. And that can be said about all of the sub-levels, subcodes within each of these larger levels of change. And hopefully we can see that more clearly as we look at the institution and individual levels of change. So looking at the individual level and institutional level, we see that peer learning surfaces at 52% at the individual level among all of the excerpts coded at the individual level. And peer learning appears in 70% of the excerpts coded at the institutional level. But also, thinking about CCRs, we were able to see that peer learning has a code occurrence rate of 91% with professional opportunities, and peer learning has an 87% code occurrence rate with workshops and trainings. And so rather it being peer learning on its own that's driving these changes seen at the individual level, which is where those CCRs were found at, that peer learning complements these other fellowship experiences to really support the changes that we see. So peer learning is a valuable program component on its own because of its prevalence seen in the stats that we see on the screen, but also when it's complemented with other fellowship experiences and program strategies, it supports alumni in building skills, relationships, and experiences. And I want to give an example from one of our partners. So the notion of peer learning as a valuable engagement component is supported by our consortium partner UASP, or University Administration Support Program, which is an IREX program that focuses on strengthening research management capacities across universities in Africa. And UASP was able to hire an external consultant to conduct a control study for UASP. And so the name of that consultancy was Global Insight, but they were able to, the control study was about having UASP participants who attended those universities and comparing those outcomes against non-participants at sister universities. And what they found was this notion of critical mass of participants and how that correlates to increased individual outcomes, such as increased confidence to perform research management tasks. And to illustrate how joint activities improve outcomes, the figure shows how confidence levels and their ability to perform research tasks increases when alumni collaborate more on joint activity. And we can see that around this engagement of about 10 activities. Next, I want to talk about the contributions to change, looking at the community and systems level. And at first, I just want to note that we looked at these independently and were able to identify those sublevels of changes, right, within each of these main levels. But when looking at the supporting factors, the supporting program structures and strategies, we combined them the community and system level because those supportive fellowship structures and strategies were similar, which is where you see in the table, networking and relationship building as a fellowship experience supports community and system level changes. And so we saw 57% of network and relationship building out of all of the excerpts coded at the community and system level. And what's important to note is when looking at all of the excerpts at the community and systems level, we see that 85% reference replicating the values and fellowship experiences that they felt empowered them as individuals to further their work. And this is really important because we have our mission statements, our values and ethos that run our programs, but we maybe don't articulate them to our alumni, to our donors and things like that. And so we have another consortium partner, an impact grant partner, who was able to conduct a ripple effects mapping activity. And this partner was New Sector Alliance. And so what is REM? This is an exercise that combines qualitative methods, appreciative inquiry, group interviewing, and mind mapping, and thematic data analysis. So it is a messy process, but it allowed their stakeholders, including alumni, community partners, and funders, to engage in this activity to see how alumni are making changes at these different levels. And so this REM exercise really corroborates this notion of how structures and strategies like program values influences alumni to contribute to change. So the structures and strategies that New Sector Alliance have, like cohort-based learning, structured coaching and mentorship, for example, not only shape what participants learn, but shape the kinds of change participants are positioned to create over time. I will pass it to Phil to take us through the barriers to change.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tanisha. And I think just building off those last points that Tanisha shared, especially around replicating the values and structures themselves being influential, I think this what stands out with this study, and I think a common trend that we see across the sector is the challenge of capturing long-term and systemic and community level impact from fellowship experiences. So those obviously contribution to change were a great way of us kind of unpacking that, trying to identify where fellowship experiences fit in that process. Barriers to change is another way that we try to explore the lasting impact, right? It's a little bit more reflective, but considering the barriers to change and how they mitigating those might influence maybe the longer term impact of fellowship experiences was a really exciting direction that we found with the consortium as a compelling approach to identifying that. And the findings were exciting to see. 86% of fellowship alumni indicated their experience or community helped them mitigate the influence of specific barriers to change in their own environments. With knowledge and skills gap, lack of network connections, and resource constraints, those three at the very bottom, standing out as kind of the main points of barriers to change that their fellowship experiences and communities mitigated. I think what's really exciting about this is it allowed us the opportunity to identify how fellowship experiences were able to meet the alumni where they were in their leadership process, right? I think we all have, again, like Tanisha mentioned, in these theories of change, these approaches that we have buy-in with our donors and with our alumni of addressing in that process. Barriers to change is a key part of how those can be impactful in local environments and then obviously in other distant environments as the communities grow. So wanted to highlight that as a really exciting takeaway, and we'll kind of unpack that in different ways in the next slide. So building off that kind of point around fellowship experiences themselves, what really stood out were cohort structured engagement and in-person programming really stood out within the CCRs that we identified. 85% and 81% respectively referenced these strategies and structures as valuable components. So people having shared experiences and being able to connect with people in person really stood out as a valuable component in how those fellowship experiences were able to manifest. I think the theme I really want to highlight there, and it's just under the orange section, is how fellowship cohorts provided a safe entry point into a new and ultimately vulnerable experience that makes it easier to build relationships and a sense of belonging through those shared experiences themselves, right? I think this is inherent in folks that have participated in those types of fellowship experiences, that having an area where everyone's in the same type of, honestly, maybe awkward moments when it's a convening or you're meeting someone new or you're in a new location or environment, having that cohort of support that you can relate to other people going through similar maybe challenges, but also just similar processes and steps throughout that way can be a valuable way of building those relationships and having elevating those kind of opportunities and experiences. Similar to the other one, what we did with this slide was highlight the fellowship experiences with the contribution to change and how they might mitigate barriers to change, understanding that we evaluated those in two separate ways. Similar to the barriers to change, networking, relationship building, professional opportunities, skills development, those stood out as the top three. As in a lot of ways, not a shocker that those also align with what we found from the FANS study. But what was fascinating here too was those kind of bottom points as well. Peer learning, really, really high, 62% of references within all of the levels of change with contributing to change, but less than 5% as motivation, mitigating barriers to change, right? Peer learning isn't necessarily what is going to mitigate a barrier to change from fellowship alumni, but it is really helpful in getting fellows over, making the most out of those experiences themselves. I think that really stood out to us from that finding, and really how cohort structure and in-person engagement facilitating those peer learning environments were really valuable. Next slide. Similar, building off again the control study that Tanisha mentioned from UASP, the United University Administration Support Program, working with Global Insights. This component explored how individual improvements over time between participants who completed a range of different formats, in-person, hybrid, and online experiences. The evaluation with that portion identified that folks that engage in hybrid and in-person formats, similar to what we were just talking about, in-person engagement, experienced statistically significant improvements compared to those who engaged in online programming. The graph to the right might look a little overwhelming, but really what you're seeing is the hybrid and in-person metrics on the right-hand side. That's the kind of a range of improvement that you're seeing, significantly above the ones on the left-hand side. The middle point is the online engagement, which is really kind of settled at the same as the control groups, which were rejected applicants that they followed up with, and then controls a common university. So they reached out to participants in similar universities in different areas that were not part of the program. And you can see that kind of consistency between the online control and consistent university components. It's important to say that online by itself, this is only within this format, the program itself as being kind of level to those control groups. It is not saying that online engagement is not effective, right? This is really just comparing those outputs from hybrid and in-person experiences within the parameters of the UASP initiative and program. So really not trying to say that online programming is ineffective in any way. This study only captures a little bit of that. And it's important to note that online programming was a very small component of the UASP's 20 years of facilitation. It really was an adaptation that many programs had to do as a result of COVID. So it's not indicting online programming as a method necessarily, but it is elevating the value of those in-person opportunities for fellows to connect in meaningful ways. That's standing out in really thoughtful components or thoughtful ways. Next slide. All right. And this saved the best for last, at least personally for me. This is one of my favorite insights from the study itself. Only 10% of survey responses indicated that skills and knowledge development were a motivation for joining their fellowship program. This is in contrast, as we've seen, to skills and knowledge development being a really big value that participants are referencing as a takeaway from their fellowship. Yet highlighting it so low as a motivation illustrates that in isolation, leaders are not driven to fellowship programs just for the sake of building skills and knowledge development. They're looking for more. And you're seeing on this graphic, professional opportunities, networking, and relationship building and personal development, again, aligning with what we found in FANS, really topping the charts with 86% and 80% respectively. So that to me, I think there's a lot more that we can unpack there. And I think there's a lot more research that we can explore of why that is and what goes into fellowship participant motivations for joining fellowship programs. And certainly distinct fellowship programs have distinct motivations. But I think it stands a way of how leaders are looking for more than just a single area of growth from their fellowship experience. And really, relationships are at the heart of that process in different ways, whether it's peer learning, whether it's shared experiences with in-person engagement, and whether it's with professional opportunities that you can connect with peers on. So to that, to me, is a really exciting insight that we found from the study that I think is a compelling area of exploration for future research. Next slide. Yes, and capturing impact and learning. So this slide in particular is building off the impact grant that we provided to Salzburg Global to facilitate what they called meetup series, which were basically community of practice convenings with practitioners outside of the research consortium, figuring out what they're struggling with regards to monitoring, evaluation, and learning initiatives, right? The 4 points that really stood out from that is open engagement and network accountability, how organizations are being able to facilitate MEL activities that are transparent and connected with the broader community, and how those barriers might be challenging to facilitate. Measuring intangible and long-term impact. We talked about this. This is a demand across the sector, exploring that community and systems level change, and to a degree, even exploring those barriers to change in really thoughtful ways. From evidence to influence, I think everyone can relate to this. How do we take all this rich insights and research that we've been pouring a lot of effort into and turning into improvements within our own programming? I think that adaptation piece is a really important part of how individual leads within programs are struggling to figure out how to make that transition. And then finally, building a learning culture and internal buy-in to explore alumni impact. Easier said than done. A lot of MEL practitioners within programs are the early adopters to new approaches, the advocates for investing in those things. That might not be consistent across an organization, right? How do you build that buy-in? How do you build that commitment to wanting to explore alumni impact in different levels of society or just beyond the initial programming itself? And I think what was really exciting was we were also able to look inward within our own consortium and really capture what ways we were facilitating evaluation. And 63% of the consortium partners, I think this was really something we were proud of in that process, identified having an increased ability in developing MEL resources for their programs, noting being in community, which is not a surprise compared to the fellowship experiences themselves. Being in community while conducting their data collection activities is something that they valued in that learning process. So that was a really exciting kind of insight from just facilitating this collaborative research study. And I think something that it does provide a good template on how we can grow as a community and sharing knowledge and resources to ensure that the entry point for evaluating impact within our alumni networks and in our programming is accessible for fellowship practitioners in different ways, because ultimately their programs meet a distinct need. But they often, as we can relate to, wear a lot of hats in that process. So not everyone has the budget for a MEL specialist or a MEL advisor on their programs, and figuring out how they can still capture meaningful insights and data from their alumni to advocate for improvements and improve those programming is a really valuable consideration. So I will go to the next slide, which is our final thing. If you take nothing else away from this report, we hope that at least you take away some thoughtful questions that we feel we have enough evidence within the report to justify. The first question, again, we hope that you bring these into your programming to inform improvements. How can we leverage peer learning as a resource to enhance other elements of the fellowship experience, like relationship building, professional opportunities, and developing skills? The second question, how can we improve access to fellowship experiences that mitigate barriers to change? We've seen 86% is a very compelling number. Fellowships experiences clearly do have an influence in mitigating barriers to change. How can we make those more accessible, obviously, to our direct participants, but potentially folks in their own communities and people that might not have the privilege of doing those fellowships directly from those experiences, right? These can be things like resource constraints, lack of network or connections, and knowledge and skills gap. And then the last thing is, how are we modeling our values in fellowship experiences to empower leaders and support their contributions to change? Highlighting, again, I think over 80% of references to those community and systems level change referencing the actual structures and strategies was striking to us. I think recognizing the how in fellowship implementation as a compelling influence to fellowship impact on community and systems level is something that deserves a lot of thought and consideration, and a lot of programs are doing that already inherently, but it's fascinating to try and see how we can kind of scale that and improve the incorporation across program elements. So those are the three considerations. I'll take us to the final slide, which is this: a big thank you for attending today and how you can stay engaged. Feel free to complete the IFN intake form, which you can find on our website, which we'll add the links into the chat shortly. You can connect with us by joining our LinkedIn page and group. And then, of course, reach out to us in the team, but reach out to our contact.impactfellowships@irex.org if you'd like to partner on activity or are just looking for any specific support. So with that, I say a sincere thank you, and I will stop the recording now and we can open it up to questions.